Welcome back to the Leadership Lab. I'm Evan McGoogan, former naval officer with over a decade of leadership experience in special operations. I'm a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and I hold an MBA and a master's in psychology of leadership from Penn State. Today, I advise executives, athletes, coaches, tradesmen, and working professionals on how to lead and influence effectively. This podcast is where I take that mix of academic research and pressure tested experience and translate it into practical lessons for you to lead, motivate, and win. Let's get into today's topic. Innovation doesn't fail because of bad ideas. It fails because leaders can't manage certain contradictions. We're often told leadership is about balance, finding the perfect midpoint between freedom and control. But I think what's closer to the truth is that leadership isn't necessarily about balance and harmony. I think a better way to describe it is tension. This episode is based on a 2011 study published in the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and Arts by Samuel Hunter, Christian Thoroughgood, Adam Myer, and Gina Ligon, titled Paradoxes of Leading Innovative Endeavors, Summary Solutions and Future Directions. The study focused on how leaders guide innovation and creativity in scientific and research settings, but I think the lessons from this study apply anywhere leaders solve novel, complex, and ill-defined problems, anywhere from lab rooms to boardrooms to special operations units. If you scroll through the leadership content on LinkedIn, you'll see countless anecdotes and stories and cases made by leadership experts hailing the benefits of giving up control. They'll tell you that real leaders, which usually just means some moralized conception of leadership that they have, is not about control. It's about autonomy and freedom. And now I'm here to tell you that it's both. And one of the many paradoxes of leadership that makes it hard is that most modern work environments where teams solve complex, ill-defined problems, leaders have to manage multiple tensions between individuals, teams, and organizations. They have to give the freedom to create while still preserving the systems and control that sustain the mission, which is efficiency, predictability, profit, or survival. That's the paradox of effective leadership: freedom and control, creativity and constraint, all at once. The study identified 14 paradoxes of innovative leadership that I believe are relevant for effective leadership in general. They're grouped into internal, team, organizational, and contextual domains. And these paradoxes exist because the creativity needed to solve complex and ill-defined problems and the control needed for survival, whether that's profitability or real survival, compete for the same space. And so your job as a leader is to manage that space and to manage that tension, not necessarily pick a side. It's been my observation that freedom without structure doesn't build creativity, it builds chaos. The literature supports this too. And one piece of data from this study cited that leaders who created structured freedom, so autonomy with direction and constraints, improved innovation performance by up to 50%, not through slogans, but through systems. So I think that this research on innovative leadership has a huge parallel to modern leadership problems in general. The expertise and leadership paradox involves acquiring a deep domain and industry-specific expertise while still simultaneously cultivating the leadership and influence skills required to direct people and manage resources effectively. During World War II, Oppenheimer had technical mastery, and Groves had command, connections, and network. But together, they were able to make the atomic bomb. This tension mirrors what I discussed in my leadership skills video. I'll put the link in the description, but the paradox suggests that effective leadership isn't just emotional intelligence, and it's not just charisma. It's also not just cohesion or connection and trust. It's all those things plus applied cognition, which is problem solving, systems thinking, and contextual expertise. You have to understand the work to lead those doing it. Understanding the work of the people around you and in other teams and departments, you'll inevitably need that to succeed in order to influence them. So one easy way to do this or to navigate this paradox, so acquiring domain-specific expertise and acquiring contextual understanding and acquiring leadership skills, is limited cross-functional mentorship and limited cross-functional assignments. So these provide a broader domain experience and a broader contextual understanding of how the organization works. Junior leaders need enough cross-pollination to understand how the organization works and build context, but not so much that it prevents them from developing their own domain expertise in their own field. And at the same time, they need training and mentorship on leadership skills of influence and communication and negotiation. So the soft people skills, all at the same time, all of which can be acquired during on-the-job training, but all of which are enhanced through structured mentorship and deliberate training protocols. Understand that domain expertise earns a baseline of respect because the people you are leading want to know that you understand the problems that you are asking them to work on. It also gives you a bigger baseline of context. And then your leadership and influence skills facilitate the execution because other people are inevitably involved. And so without domain expertise, without contextual understanding, and without influence skills, solving ill-defined problems in a team setting is virtually impossible. Paradox of evaluation and generation involves both being the gatekeeper who judges ideas and the generator who encourages new ones. So balancing critique with creativity. Leaders must be able to balance encouragement and scrutiny at the same time. They're the gas and brake pedal of innovation and creativity and solving ill-defined problems. Encourage too much and you get noise without any sort of direction. And if you evaluate too harshly, then you're going to kill creativity before it matures into a problem or a solution that can actually be moved out on. So really, really effective leaders are ones who are able to create an environment where novel ideas can form, they can breathe a little bit, and they can mature rather than roam around aimlessly. And that means separating the creative process from the critical process long enough for each to work. And developmental feedback systems are a really, really solid way to do that. So feedback that's focused on process improvement rather than outcome judgment. And the research, as well as my own personal experience, shows that this sort of system significantly increases team creativity because it turns the criticism into recalibration. The insight here is that effective leaders know that timing in the creative process is really critical. They allow ideation to flourish early on, but then they narrow their focus with structured evaluation later. It's a choreography and it's a dance of curiosity and control at the same time. Most leaders, especially ones that are under pressure, and particularly those who are highly conscientious, meaning those who have a high preference for organization, which tend to be most managers, tend to do this process backwards. They evaluate way too early and way too soon, which shuts down the exploration part of this process before ideas have the time to mature. When people on your team anticipate judgment too soon, they're going to self-censor their ideas. And the result isn't the efficiency that managers are after. It actually silences ideas before they can evolve your team or the organization. This paradox is psychological as much as it is procedural. It requires the psychological composure to let unfinished ideas live long enough to become valuable, despite your preference or your tendency to criticize. And it also demands a certain degree of patience and emotional intelligence to challenge the work and the idea without damaging the ownership of those who have the idea in the first place. In the early days of my platoon commander a few years ago, I was faced with a really challenging and really aggravating problem, at least at the time it was, and one that was also demoralizing to my team if I didn't resolve it. And so we didn't have a set deployment agenda during our deployment window. And for a group of hungry SEALs who wanted meaningful work, this scenario can be catastrophic for morale. And it makes all the preparation and all the training that we're required to do for deployment certification seem a lot less worth it because we had no direction afterwards. To make matters worse, we had very little guidance from my own leadership at the time of what I should orient my platoon's future towards. Now, fortunately for me, I had a really smart leadership team. And I was also fortunate enough with my prior assignments to at least know where I should start. And so myself and my leadership team dove into several weeks of exploration of as many strategic documents as we could get our hands on and then read. And then from there, we reverse engineered a set of potential avenues we could at least explore based on our understanding of the military's regional priorities around the world. Now, what we discovered was that most of them would be covered by the deploying units already slated for those areas. So I assessed that the likelihood of most of those ideas had a very low chance of getting investment from my leadership. There was one that we thought showed immense promise, and that was deploying use of regional command funds to conduct training and operations in the domestic US, something that the West Coast based SEAL teams hadn't done, at least to my knowledge. And as we continued to flush out this potential idea, the stars ended up aligning. A SEAL team from the East Coast pulled out of the exercise, whose funds could potentially sponsor the training and operations that we were starting to conceptualize, and we jumped on it immediately. And then we started the process all over again of ideation and then evaluation, because we had a new set of parameters and new information. Without going through this concerted effort with discipline of ideation and evaluation paradox, this opportunity never would have presented itself, and we never would have had the clarity to know when to jump on it when it did present itself. So here's a quick, simple way to operationalize this paradox, the generation evaluation paradox, in your team or your organization. First is to separate the phases. So during the ideation sessions, you have to ban evaluation, at least temporarily. The only rule during those sessions is contribution. And then the second step is to establish criteria early on. So before moving to the evaluation stage, you need to define what good looks like to you. Now, for my leadership team, we wanted a few things. We wanted good training, we wanted good training locations, and we wanted good professional development for the guys in my platoon, because we couldn't guarantee a deployment. But what we could guarantee was that we could fight for those things, and we could get at least one of them. We ended up getting all of them, but at the time we didn't know that. And then the third way to operationalize this paradox is using developmental feedback. So every critique of this creative process has to include some sort of forward direction, even if it's a low resolution forward direction. So concrete suggestion, or as much as you can make it concrete, or an improvement path. This is a really simple model to help ensure that the creative phase produces a volume of ideas that you need to actually get something good. And then the evaluation phase produces, or at least reveals, what's actually of value. So the key takeaway here for the generation evaluation paradox is that effective leadership, whether that's in innovation or while solving ill-defined problems, it's not about constant positivity, and it's not about ruthless critique. It's about sequencing both at the right time. So if you generate without fear and evaluate without bias, and then connect both through process discipline, that's how you're able to build a system that creates better ideas, that creates more creative ideas. And also it creates better people over time. Creative personalities and team cohesion paradox involves building team cohesion among individuals with a high degree of competence and a strong desire for autonomy and a strong preference for divergent thinking and a high degree of trait openness, all of which are personalities that are naturally resistant to structure and management, yet require structure and management to collaborate effectively. From a personality perspective, creative people crave a high degree of freedom, and so do competent people, although for slightly different reasons. Teams that are part of a larger organization require a certain degree of control and a certain degree of order to keep them oriented in the same direction. And the research shows that creative teams are much more likely to succeed when they do have a degree of structured conflict, which is a disagreement that stays focused on ideas rather than people and identity, particularly with creative people who invest a lot of cognitive resources and a lot of pride into their ideas. It's sort of baked into their personality that they have to create, and that's attached to their identity. So critiquing their ideas they can misconstrue that as an attack on their personal worth. So you have to be really careful with creative people, someone like an artist. This isn't specific to creative people, although I think it has to do with people in general. I just think the research in my experience suggests that creative people are much more sensitive to this. The reason lies in psychology. Creatives score higher in trait openness to experience. So they want to explore, they want to mix ideas, and they want to resist or even dissolve rigid boxes around ideas. They can't make something new unless they destroy something else in the process. And usually that's some sort of existing way of thinking. They think divergently like this. Highly competent people also don't want to feel micromanaged. Managers and operators, by contrast, they tend to think convergently like this. So they're linear, they're procedural, and they're execution focused. They want and desire to oversee and refine. Now, the problem is that all of these things are essential all at the same time, and they naturally clash. One generates options, the other further narrows them. Team cohesion is still necessary for solving novel, ill-defined problems or producing innovation. In creative settings, or when working on these novel, ill-defined problems, task-related conflict is nearly unavoidable. Because of that, interpersonal conflict is highly, highly likely. Now, that's not a bug, it's a feature of what it takes to solve an ill-defined problem. It's part of the creative process. So leaders have to be able to manage that conflict very carefully and very deliberately. And this study highlights team processes that make it work are ones that build psychological safety or strength, if that's the way you want to characterize it, through competence, so that debate doesn't become hostile. They also use structured feedback loops to focus on task friction rather than interpersonal friction, so that they can get to solution clarity faster. And then they also maintain alignment on their shared purpose, even when the methods and waves of thinking diverge a little bit. The tension between convergent and divergent thinking is what fuels innovation and starts hard problems, but it also makes it much more likely that there's going to be task-related conflict and therefore interpersonal conflict. It's still a necessary requirement, but it demands intelligent and deliberate management and leadership of that process. With this paradox, remember that creatives want to break patterns and managers want to build them. But leadership, while solving novel, ill-defined problems or pursuing innovation, is learning how to leverage both at the same time without letting them destroy each other. The vision and autonomy paradox involves providing a clear vision and direction to the team while still allowing freedom and independence in how that vision is pursued. Leaders have to provide a direction without dictating the how too much, particularly when it comes to creative people and highly competent people. The less experienced your people are, the more structure that you should provide them. When it comes to creatives and highly competent people, too much control is going to suffocate their creativity, and too much control is going to suffocate their expression of their competence. On the other end, too much freedom could create drift, and it often does with creative people. Now, the goal is not to let go of control. The goal is to calibrate your control and figure out where and when to apply it. And I think this is something that a lot of leadership coaches get wrong. They'll say leadership isn't about control. And I think they're half right. I think effective leadership is about controlling the right things at the right time. What makes it really hard is that it's a moving target. So leaders have to articulate a vision, whether it's their own or their organizations, that aligns with some sort of higher intent, but still leaves room for autonomy. Now, the vision should define clear but wide parameters that are enough to orient towards some sort of definable end state, but not enough to overly restrict those that are in pursuit of it. The restriction and freedom paradox involves offering enough time and resources for your people so that they can pursue their creative work or express their competence while still applying the pressure and structure necessary to maintain focus and performance that you need out of them. Innovation or expression of competence needs a certain degree of freedom, but it also needs the friction provided by structure and constraint in order to keep it oriented and to maintain momentum. And so the research shows that flexible boundaries produce way more creativity than total freedom. So pressure, when structured correctly, creates a ton of energy. And that's why the 3M's 15% rule and Google's 20% time rule work. So it's freedom inside structure. These companies allow their employees a certain degree of company time in order to pursue their own creative endeavors. And we get things like Google email out of it. Pressure isn't the enemy of creativity. When done to the right degree, it's what gives creativity shape. When I was leading my SEAL platoon, I'd often ask the person responsible for a task how long they thought they needed to complete it. And whatever they said, I'd cut that time in half and ask for an update by them. So not necessarily completion, but a touch point. It wasn't me attempting to micromanage them. It was about creating a productive kind of pressure. And then I'd also adjust that a little bit based on my perception of their competence when it comes to completing the task. And the more skilled or experienced the person was, the more freedom I would grant them, because I didn't want to stifle their creativity or competence, but I still needed them on some sort of timeline most of the time. But by cutting that estimate in half was usually a good rule of thumb, and it kept momentum high, but it also kept their complacency low. Otherwise, they might wait till the last day to do it, and then they give me a poor product. And that approach gave them ownership of the how, but ensured the when maintained some necessary degree of urgency. And in ill-defined environments, that sort of iteration and touch point iteration beats out perfection. So you can always correct the direction if you have enough touch points, but you can't necessarily correct inertia fast enough to meet a deadline if you wait too long. And that's the paradox in practice. You have to compress time enough to create urgency, but you also have to loosen control to produce the necessary creativity to solve an innovative pursuit or to solve an ill-defined problem. The insularity cohesion paradox involves cultivating a strong internal cohesion within a team while preventing isolation from the larger organization and subsequent loss of alignment with its objectives. When navigating this paradox, leaders have to foster cohesion strong enough to create identity and create trust and cohesion and speed, but permeable enough that it stays connected with the broader mission of the organization that they're intended to support. So team cohesion builds trust and it builds efficiency and confidence and mutual understanding. All those things are true. But when it overgrows, it breeds groupthink and it breeds isolation and it breeds resistance to outside influence and operational blindness. So it creates a sort of cultishness. And whether it's in special operations or sports, this is in a constant tension. The tighter the bond, the greater the risk of insularity, which is the belief that your team knows better than everyone else and doesn't need anyone's help. And when that happens, collaboration breaks down and innovation ends up stalling. So while it may seem safer and seem better in the short term, in the long term, particularly if you're working on solving ill-defined problems or pursuing some sort of innovation, it's going to be super destructive to that. So the insight here is that effective leaders are able to figure out that unity isn't necessarily just isolation. It's more of an integration. So there's a unique culture and strong internal bonds that are necessary for a small team setting, but they have to be ones that complement the larger organization. And leaders have to figure out a way to maintain external channels of communication and interaction with other organizations outside of them and other teams outside of them, and whether that's in their own organization or whether that it's external to the organization. And so that tension is what allows teams to maintain focus on their own internal initiatives and create a culture that they buy into without losing the situational awareness that they need to see how they fit into the larger picture. Here's a practical way to operationalize this insularity cohesion paradox. Create two separate deliberate communication rhythms with your team. One's internal and one's external. On the internal side, you should be holding regular team syncs that reinforce identity, that reinforce shared standards, that reinforce the mutual trust that your team needs to be cohesive. But then externally, you need to schedule some sort of frequent and consistent touch points with other departments, other leaders, and other stakeholders to share updates and learn how those outside perspectives can benefit you and where you fit into the larger picture. And you can take this one step further by assigning a liaison role, which is someone responsible for maintaining that external visibility while the team stays focused on execution. As a leader, that should probably be your role. But if you have someone that is really good at networking and really good at selling ideas, then you can consider leveraging them instead, because it might be a better use of their strengths than you doing it if you do a poor job at it. Either way, doing something like that is going to help ensure that your team cohesion is strong without creating a silo of isolation. So the main takeaway here from this paradox is that effective leaders are ones who are able to build teams that are internally bonded to one another, but that are externally aligned with the organization or with the team that they're a part of. So they're strong enough to move fast together, but they're humble enough to stay connected and aligned to the larger organization. Champion evaluator paradox involves both acting as a critical evaluator of ideas within the team and an enthusiastic advocate when selling ideas to upper management and external stakeholders and other leadership types. So leaders have to balance the conviction to push an idea forward and sell it with the composure to test it first. Only what endures that disciplined scrutiny is actually worth selling. And both skills often live in conflict with one another, like all these other paradoxes. And it's a psychological tension between optimism and skepticism. Idea champions are driven by belief. They see what could be, and evaluators are driven by caution. So they protect what already works. So you have creatives and managers dynamic again. Same dilemma. When the idea champion dominates the conversation, then bad ideas end up going unchecked. But when the idea evaluator or the manager dominates the conversation, then good ideas never end up leaving the ground because they scrutinize them to death and they just never lift off. In complex organizations that solve novel and ill-defined problems or pursue some sort of innovation, then the teams tend to fail less often because of bad ideas and more often because of premature evaluation. So the managers or leaders are the ones that end up killing potential before it has time to mature and evolve. The most effective, best leaders, both by what the research suggests and from my own experience, are the ones who are able to protect the new ideas long enough to survive early criticism, but not so long that they escape accountability and escape the needed scrutiny to actually make them feasible. The insight here is that effective leaders have to learn to switch between both modes, or they at least are able to tap into people on their team that allows their team to switch between both modes. So they champion to create movement, and then they evaluate to ensure stability. And they also know when an idea needs incubation and needs more development. And then they also know when that idea is ready and needs to be inspected. When I was leading my platoon in the SEAL teams, we were slated for a deployment, but had no operational tasking, which left us in a sort of limbo state. And when you have a highly competent, highly trained team that's hungry for meaningful work, but no clear mission, it's a terrible place to be as a leader in the military. It gave me a team that was hungry, but had nothing to chew on. Rather than wait for someone to give me guidance, which may not have ever came, my leadership team and I decided to take a little bit of initiative, analyze the environment for any opportunities, and we ended up finding a creative loophole. The idea was to leverage funding from another organization to deploy domestically. Now, the idea in its early phases sold immediately because it came with money, meaning my leadership didn't have to spend any of their money on my idea. And in a resource-constrained environment, which typically is the case in the military, or at least that's what everyone tells you, that's a huge opportunity. Now, what the leadership didn't know is what I intended to do with those funds. I didn't do anything illegal or immoral, but historically, West Coast SEAL teams didn't train for winter warfare or Arctic warfare. And I plan to change that. So we designed in isolation a winter warfare, Arctic warfare program that would build a new skill set for my platoon and also an identity for them. Now, early on, I kept this concept really compartmentalized, not to deceive my leadership, but to protect the idea in order that I could develop it and refine it further before I sold it. Now, the military approval process, which I was fortunate enough to be really familiar with, doesn't reward fragile ideas, which it would have been really early on. And it doesn't reward ideas that aren't grounded in a high degree of research, particularly if they don't have a precedent. And so if I shared my idea too soon, or at least if I shared too many details about my idea too soon, it would end up dying in layers of bureaucracy and risk intolerance and scrutiny. I was fortunate enough to have enough wisdom to incubate it long enough, and I timed the communication of my plan in such a way that it became easier to refine rather than reject. So once it was defensible, I brought it to the evaluators and I brought it to the specialists and I brought it to the stakeholders so that they could help me sharpen it and actually make it executable. But I did so at a point where it was easier to do that than easier to turn it off because of the commitments that we made. And that approach, where I was able to protect the idea and then expose it at the right time, is one practical expression of this paradox that I was able to employ. So here's how to operationalize this paradox. When developing a new initiative, create two phases. The first is incubation, and the second is evaluation. In the incubation phase, isolate a small, trusted group to stress test the idea privately. In my case, it was myself and my own leadership team. And then in the evaluation phase, you have to deliberately widen the circle to bring in all the dissenting voices and all the wisdom that might actually make it better. Now, part of this is choosing a criteria for how to transition and when to transition between the two. A good rule of thumb is about 70 to 80%. Once your solution or your idea has a 70 to 80% degree of being defined and the resource estimates are validated, this creates a really reliable, defined process of accountability and scrutiny without stifling the innovation. So the key takeaway here for this paradox is that innovative leadership And leadership that is working on novel, ill defined problems require a certain rhythm. There's an advocacy and analysis that happen in alternating cycles. You promote ideas to build momentum, and then you evaluate them to ensure that there's a necessary degree of precision. The art and the heart of this paradox is knowing which hat to wear and when. The exploration and exploitation paradox of leadership involves pursuing novel ideas and experimentation, which is the exploration side, while still refining and executing proven strategies that sustain team or organizational performance, which is the exploitation side. So leaders have to hold two competing impulses at the same time. They have to be curious enough to pursue discovery, but they also have to be disciplined enough to constantly deliver. And it's a constant oscillation between divergent thinking and discipline, which is searching for what could be while still protecting what's proven to work. And in psychology and organizational theory, this tension is almost a universal phenomenon. So, explorers, creative people like artists, they tend to have a high degree of trait openness and a high tolerance for uncertainty. Now, exploiters, which tend to be the manager types, they value structure and systems and repeatability, and both are essential. And the leader's job is to somehow synchronize the two without letting one consume the other. Teams without disciplined managers explore endlessly without any sort of implementation. And teams that can't tolerate uncertainty exploit endlessly until all the innovation dries up. And so the best leaders are ones who can build environments that do both simultaneously. They give permission to their creative types to explore inside a certain set of acceptable constraints. There are boundaries that actually encourage discovery without dissolving focus on what the real orientation or the vision is. If all you do is explore, you end up drifting. And if all you do is execute, you end up actually decaying. The insight here on this paradox is that effective leaders have to engineer controlled exploration. They create a deliberate cycle where teams test and fail and refine while still maintaining operational discipline needed to produce. And that's how teams and organizations actually evolve without losing the traction that they need to maintain to pursue what they're actually after. Now, this paradox manifested during our Arctic Warfare Initiative back when I was in the SEAL teams, and we had to prepare for a mission that we'd never done before. We had to prepare for training that we'd never done before, which ended up becoming a 2 week glacier operation on skis. And I didn't know the best way to train for it or even where to train for it. Instead of gambling on a single approach, I had multiple elements of my team explore different training venues simultaneously. So we looked at civilian resorts, we looked at military facilities, and we even looked at backcountry environments. We looked at California, we looked at Colorado, we even looked at places in Montana. And by running these exploration cycles all in parallel, we ended up discovering that the optimal training environment faster than if we had committed to one option earlier on. It had to switch gears. And so that's the one operational version of this paradox: exploration guided by structure. Exploration without direction wastes time. Direction without exploration wastes potential. So here's a simple way to operationalize this. Set aside a small percentage of every project cycle for experimentation: 10%, 20%, whatever's acceptable to you, which is something that Google does, something that 3M does. And then define clear checkpoints to evaluate what those experiments actually reveal. If something shows promise, fold that into your exploitation cycle and see if you can pursue it further. And if not, extract the lessons, shelve it, scrap it, and then move on. That rhythm of exploring, evaluating, exploiting, and repeating is something that can turn innovation from a risk and a gamble into something that's a repeatable and sustainable process. Risk and safety paradox involves tolerating the risk, time, and flexibility necessary for creative pursuits while still keeping the financial and operational costs under control to ensure your team's long term sustainability. So, in this paradox, leaders have to manage the tension between pursuing the boundaries of what people consider possible and protect the systems people, reputation, and resources that allow those pursuits to be sustainable in the long run. So risk fuels progress and then safety preserves it. Without one or the other, innovation ends up collapsing. Now, in most organizations that are attempting to solve novel and ill defined problems, these forces are going to sit at odds with one another. Creative people who are typically the most innovative are drawn towards novelty and experimentation and sometimes aggressive timelines. Now, safety oriented leaders, which are typically the managers, are going to be drawn more towards predictability, more towards compliance, and more towards process control. Now, both instincts are right in the innovative process, but they are incomplete on their own when it comes to producing creative ideas and producing innovation and solving novel, ill defined problems. So, the challenge for leaders when it comes to navigating the tension between risk and safety isn't to eliminate one or the other. It's to mitigate it and govern them down to an acceptable level. Risk has to be contained in structures and process that still allow bold and creative action and preventing irreversible or catastrophic loss. And that's why effective leaders build systems that encourage a certain degree of calculated risk rather than reckless risk. And they do that by setting guardrails rather than enforcing cages or straitjackets on their people. So, safety during innovative pursuits or while attempting to solve ill defined problems isn't the absence of risk, it's a mastery of. Now, the way to operationalize this, or at least one practical way, when you're leading a new project that requires some degree of innovation or you're trying to solve some sort of ill defined problem, deliberately assign two lanes of assessment. One lane is the opportunity lane, and then the other lane is the exposure lane. The opportunity lane asks, what can we gain if this works? The exposure lane, on the other hand, asks, what do we lose if it doesn't? For as long as you're able to, you run both assessments side by side. When those two lanes converge into a decision, that's not you removing risk. That's you actually contextualizing risk and understanding it so that you can mitigate risk down to what you consider acceptable, whatever that happens to be. Now, this is the same approach I used when I was leading my platoon in the Arctic warfare project that I keep talking about. The conditions were inherently dangerous. We were isolated, cold temperatures, unfamiliar, and really, really dangerous terrain. We were traversing what was in all likelihood first ascent terrain, meaning no one had been there before, or not enough people had been there enough to document the dangers. So every day when we left camp, we were encountering new things all in real time. Now, part of how I mitigated those risks was by conducting a 10-day preparatory training in Breckenridge, Colorado, so that we could build individual and team skills and test gear before ever setting foot on the glacier as a way to mitigate risk down to what I thought and my leadership thought was an acceptable level. And so that structure and that process didn't reduce our ambition and didn't reduce what we thought was a creative solution to a hard problem. It made the ambition that we had actually feasible and actually executable. The lesson in this paradox and the lesson from that example is that safety and risk aren't necessarily opposites. They are interdependent forces when it comes to innovation. And when they are held in tension appropriately, they they can turn the pressure of perceived or real danger and perceived or real risk into a high degree of precision of action. The intrinsic extrinsic paradox involves instilling intrinsic motivation using the more readily available extrinsic or external motivational tools. Leaders have to inspire some sort of internal drive from their team, even though the most easiest and the most readily available motivational tools are often the external ones. Based on your position of leadership's formal authority, you're going to have a different set of external motivational tools available to you, whether that's bonuses, public recognition, or other perks that help spark short term motivation in your people. Even judicious punishment and corrective counseling that gets documented can be thrown into that mix. Now, these all fall into the transactional leadership category, which gets a lot of hate, particularly by all the geniuses on LinkedIn. The research shows very clearly, and my experience suggests that these are all great tools when they're used in moderation and when they're timed well. Now, they definitely lose their value and have diminished returns and even negative returns when they are used too often and relied on too heavily. Intrinsic motivation, which we can characterize as things like curiosity and desire for mastery and pride in your work, those things have a much better track record of sustaining long term performance if they can be leveraged well enough. The hard part about this paradox is that intrinsic motivation can't be handed out like pay or bonuses or perks or counseling and punishment. You can't pay people to care beyond a certain point. You can't punish people to care beyond a certain point. Can do is create an environment that makes caring more natural and makes it easier. Part of that is understanding your people. You can't lead your people and you can't influence your people if you don't actually know anything about them and you don't actually care about them, both of which they can sense and understand really quickly. Learning what they're curious about, what they want to master, and what they would be proud of, just as a few quick examples. Now, there will likely be a common set of things across your team and organization, but there will also be a uniqueness based on the individual. And it behooves you as a leader to understand what that uniqueness is because you can leverage that not in a malicious way, but benevolent way to influence them, to get them to do the things that you want them to do and the things that you need them to do as a leader because they actually want to do it. So the insight here is that extrinsic incentives can be really, really effective at getting compliance in the short term, and they can be effective at motivating in the short term. But it's intrinsic motivation, the internal motivators that actually build long term commitment. But it's a much squishier thing to manage and navigate. It's hard to get a hold of, and it's hard to figure out what those things are. And it's sometimes even harder to manage it once you actually do. The best leaders are the ones who connect the rewards and the punishments in the form of professional corrective action, like counseling, to deeper meaning. So they align what people do with why it matters. And a simple way to operationalize this paradox is to tie recognition to identity rather than just performance. So instead of saying good job to someone, which isn't very helpful, you can say, this is what you did well exactly. And that's exactly how someone on this team thinks. So you're tying their performance, whether it was poor or whether it was excellent performance, with the identity of the team or not the identity of the team. So it creates a contrast that's much easier to understand. Now, you're not just rewarding the result of the performance, you're also rewarding the mindset behind it, which taps into elements of pride and elements of mastery that I was talking about earlier. And that's how you integrate the levers of transactional leadership with the levers of transformational leadership. And it helps you navigate that tension between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and therefore the paradox between the two. The local and long term paradox involves leaders instilling a passion and drive and motivation for single projects, but also maintaining the necessary long term strategic orientation. So, with this paradox, leaders have to balance the tension between focusing on today without losing sight of tomorrow and the next week and the next month and the next year and the next quarter, or perhaps even 5 years from now, depending on the project. It's the tension between building short term intensity and then long term endurance. So that's the integration of charismatic leadership in the short term to energize and initiate action, and the pragmatic leadership to build systems and processes that facilitate long term output, which is something I've discussed on this channel before. Now, too much focus on immediate goals leads to burnout and tunnel vision, but too much focus on distant horizon goals kills the necessary urgency to meet the real timelines that most leaders are going to have and that most organizations needed for production and profitability and firm survival. Leaders have to balance the tension between staying close enough to care, but also far enough to see what the whole field looks like. And it's a constantly moving target between zooming in and zooming out. The insight here is that effective leaders can oscillate between the tactical immersion of the short term and the strategic elevation of the long term. They zoom in to motivate and reduce friction where it occurs, and then they zoom out to assess and realign their team. Here's a simple way to operationalize this local long term paradox. In every project debrief, which you should be having, ask, how does what we learn here shape what we'll do in 6 weeks from now, or shape what we do 6 months from now, or 6 years from now, even? Whatever the most appropriate time horizon is, and maybe it's all of them at the same time. That single question or series of questions, most likely, is going to help you tie tactical action and execution with strategic evaluation and evolution. It's a practical reminder for yourself and your team that what you work on today and tomorrow and next week build next month's and next quarter's and next year's capability. Competition collaboration paradox involves facilitating a certain degree of openness with other teams and other departments or other organizations, but still protecting your team's competitive advantage at the same time. We live in an era that worships collaboration. And I'm not going to say that's not important, but in environments where a competitive edge is required to survive and teams fight for scarce resources, collaboration has to have certain boundaries. Otherwise, it destroys the advantages that you have and can end up destroying any ideas you have. And so leaders have to navigate the tension between opening their teams up to new ideas and assistance and investment from other organizations, other teams, without exposing their competitive edge too soon. How do you do that, you might ask? You have to collaborate enough to grow and compete enough to survive. Going back to my Arctic warfare project and the SEAL teams, where I was setting up this big proposal for our training in Alaska, from one perspective, it was world-class development. We were hiring a group of snow experts out of Colorado to come train us in an austere, isolated, and desolate environment up on an Alaskan glacier where a lot of things could go wrong, including avalanches, crevasse accidents, falls. The nearest point of care was over 4 hours away. And our preparatory training was very similar in that regard, although we ended up landing on training in Breckenridge, Colorado, because our organization had a precedent of training there. Our instructors knew the area and knew where to train. And it also had the infrastructure, being a huge commercial ski town, to facilitate the safe training. On the other hand, it was also Breckenridge, which is one of the most popular ski towns in the world. So while we were getting ready to go, every platoon in the team was deploying somewhere that they weren't really excited about. And so it would have been really, really easy for everyone to write this training off as what the military calls a boondoggle, which is just a fun trip with little to no value. And obviously, that's not how I saw it because I was super invested in this, although I knew it would be a fun trip in addition to the training value that we were going to get. And so until the idea was developed enough that I could actually sell it, despite the obvious scrutiny that I was going to receive, I had to maintain some degree of secrecy in order to keep our competitive edge and keep pursuing this initiative that we wanted. And then once it was ready for scrutiny, or at least when I thought it was ready for scrutiny, then I could involve the necessary collaboration and outside perspective to move my idea closer to execution. So here's the important takeaway from that example in this paradox. Effective leaders practice a certain degree of selective openness, where they know where and when to invite feedback and then when to stay silent on it. They have an understanding that not every problem benefits from collective input all the time. And this is especially critical for innovative teams or teams working on novel proposals while fighting for scarce resources, like mine was. And so if everything is shared, nothing ends up being proprietary or protected. If nothing is shared, then innovation and good ideas end up dying in isolation. By navigating this paradox well, you're able to stay open enough to learn and evolve and adapt, but still closed enough, long enough, and at the right times to actually end up winning and maintaining your competitive edge. Feedback rigidity paradox involves receiving and using feedback, but not being dictated by that feedback. Feedback fuels growth. It's pretty obvious, but an over reliance on it actually can kill your originality. Leaders have to learn to listen deeply and genuinely to sources of their feedback without surrendering their conviction in what they believe to be right or what they believe to be true. Use feedback, but don't be used by it. Now, the difficulty with this paradox is largely a psychological one because most people equate listening with agreeing, and that's not true. That's not how you should approach it. Just because you receive feedback doesn't necessarily mean you have to change, although perhaps you should. And that's the point of listening. You should definitely listen and consider what you're hearing because there might be a kernel of truth to it. Or the person giving you feedback might be trying to communicate something to you that is important and that is indicative of a real problem, but they aren't actually effective at communicating it to you. And so the feedback that you're receiving might be indicative of a real problem, but the way they're communicating obscures the root cause of why they are actually giving you the feedback in the first place. So you have to listen. I'll give you an example. The SEAL teams uses a version of 360 feedback. And this was done every 6 months or so over a 2 year period. Every 6 months, your peers, your subordinates, and your own leadership would have an opportunity to evaluate you and give you feedback. And it was largely anonymous, but not exclusively. There was a younger member of my platoon who gave me a piece of feedback. And this feedback came from when we were at a training location and we had just finished up a few days of hard training with late nights, long days, and we were cleaning up the space that we were using to operate out of. And there were about 50 people in not that big of a space, cleaning up, picking up trash, sweeping the floors, putting away chairs. And there wasn't much work to be done. A lot of people were just kind of wandering around looking like they were picking up trash. I thought it'd be a better use of my time than to fight over the three brooms that were there, to talk to some of my leadership about some of the longer term plans that we had. Now, this younger member of my platoon saw that and thought I was neglecting my responsibilities to clean up. Now, he's not necessarily wrong that I wasn't cleaning up and perhaps I should have been. The way he communicated this feedback, he was basically communicating that I wasn't doing my job as a member of the platoon. Now, instead of writing this off and saying, well, this kid doesn't know what he's talking about, I dug into it and thought about it. And what I landed on was that, well, it's not about the broom and it's not about the cleaning. It was more about he didn't understand what our roles and responsibilities were, me being the platoon commander and him being a younger member of the platoon, and that a better use of my time in order to pursue that division of labor and those roles and responsibilities was not actually fighting over the three brooms amongst the 50 people. It was actually talking to my leadership about what the next couple of weeks were going to look like for us. That's one example. Point is, effective leadership requires filtering of your feedback, not obedience to it. The insight here is that leaders who overreact to every opinion risk drifting from what's truly important. And the leaders who ignore input stagnate because they isolate themselves from the truth. And so the real skill in this paradox lies in identifying legitimate signal versus noise. And that counts with every source of feedback, whether it's from your subordinates, whether it's from your peers, your superiors, your clients, customers, your partners, etc. Now, a quick strategy to operationalize this feedback paradox is to filter feedback through three simple questions. The first question is this feedback about the goal or about the method? The second question is, does it reflect the truth that I need to be aware of, or does it reflect a preference? And should that preference override mine? And then the third question is, if we or I act on it, does it actually make us better or more unique, or does it make us more average? So that's a really simple way to stay adaptive through the feedback process and through the paradox of feedback without becoming overreactive to it. Failure success paradox in leadership involves developing a team or organizational culture that embraces risk and failure, yet is still able to produce successful outcomes. Many leadership coaches say that you should embrace failure, and many leaders say they actually do embrace failure. But sometimes it's really hard to know which leaders actually mean it because their actions, or perhaps better way to say it is their reactions, don't make it clear. Embracing failure is really easy to say, and it's really easy to romanticize as something that you should do, but it's really hard to tolerate and actually do. And one of the big reasons is that too much failure has legitimate consequences. Also hurts our ego when we fail. This paradox exists in leadership is one that's unavoidable. So creativity and innovation and solving novel, ill-defined problems that tend to exist in the modern workplace require a certain degree of risk tolerance, and risk inevitably produces failure. Now, the leader's job is to build a culture and set of systems that support safe to fail experiments in the pursuit of your goals. And then, furthermore, build a culture and set of systems that then learns from those failures without lowering standards. Failure isn't the opposite of success, it's the price you pay for it. High performance teams, whether in the corporate world, elite military units, elite sports teams, cutting edge scientific pursuits, they aren't fearless of risk. It's more accurate to say they are failure literate. They understand what they can fail safely and what they can't, and then they move quickly and learn even quicker. They recover nearly immediately, and then they debrief those failures relentlessly so that they can reorient and move out on overcoming the next obstacle with precision and speed. One way to operationalize this paradox is that before you take a risk, you can define three really simple boundaries that can help you navigate this process. The first boundary is scope. Ask yourself, what can you afford to lose in pursuit of your defined success metrics? The second boundary is time. So, determining how fast you will measure results whenever you fail or whenever you succeed. And then the last and third boundary is recovery. So, determining how you're going to extract the learning from said failure or said success. And using a simple structure like this with scope, time, and recovery is going to help you turn risk and perceived risk into real growth, and then turning failure into feedback. All these paradoxes seem to point to one simple truth when it comes to leadership, and that is being an effective leader isn't necessarily about balance. It's about precision in navigating ideas that seem to contradict themselves, but have to both occur at the same time. I don't think effective leadership is really about giving up control, as so many of the leadership coaches out there would like you to believe. I think it's more accurate to say that effective leadership, whether that's in creative and innovative pursuits or just in general, is more about pursuing the mastery of how much control to apply and when. Inside the leadership lab, I teach leaders on how to operationalize these ideas that are abstract, moralized, romanticized version of leadership, and how to turn tension into traction and paradoxes into usable systems and abstract visions into practical, tactical execution. If you want frameworks and skills for this, check out the Leadership Lab on School. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you all next time.